Picture this: 3 men trapped behind enemy lines, blood pouring from their wounds, surrounded by thousands of German soldiers. No fuel, no ammunition, no hope. Military command had already written them off as dead, but one pilot refused to accept it. What happened next became the most insane rescue mission of World War II, a mission so dangerous, so impossible, that even today, military historians can't believe anyone survived it. This is the story of the glider rescue that defied every rule of war, every law of physics, and every expectation of human survival. It was April 1945, deep in the forests of Nazi Germany. 3 American airmen, Lieutenant Bill Lowery, Sergeant Sam Pennington, and Corporal Mike Daniels, were shot down during a bombing raid over Berlin. Their B-17 bomber exploded mid-air, and somehow, miraculously, they parachuted into enemy territory. But their parachutes had barely touched the ground when German patrols spotted them. The 3 men ran. Bullets zipped past their heads, tearing through leaves and bark. Lowery's leg was shattered from the crash, Pennington had shrapnel embedded in his chest, and Daniels was bleeding from his abdomen. They stumbled through the freezing forest for hours, leaving a trail of blood that the Germans followed like bloodhounds. By dawn, they collapsed in a small clearing, unable to move another inch. German troops surrounded the clearing within minutes. Over 200 soldiers formed a tight circle, rifles aimed at the 3 dying Americans. But the German commander, Captain Ernest Weber, made a strange decision. Instead of executing them on the spot, he radioed his superiors, reporting that he had captured 3 enemy airmen who needed immediate medical attention. Weber was no humanitarian. He wanted intelligence, and dead men couldn't talk. Meanwhile, back at the Allied base in France, Major Richard Barclay received the impossible news. A German radio transmission had been intercepted. 3 American airmen were alive, but would die within hours without rescue. Every military advisor told Barclay the same thing: forget them. There was no way to extract soldiers from behind enemy lines. The nearest Allied troops were 70 miles away, and the Germans controlled every road, every bridge, every airfield. But Barclay had one crazy idea. There was a single CG-4A Waco glider sitting on the runway, a flimsy aircraft made of fabric and wood, with no engine, no weapons, and no armor. Gliders were normally towed behind planes and released to land troops in combat zones. But Barclay wanted to do something that had never been done: fly a glider behind enemy lines, land it in hostile territory, load the wounded men, and somehow take off again. His own staff thought he'd lost his mind. Barclay needed a pilot insane enough to volunteer. Enter Captain Ernest "Lucky" Sullivan, a glider pilot with a death wish and nothing to lose. Sullivan had already survived 3 crash landings, 2 of which should have killed him. When Barclay explained the mission, Sullivan didn't hesitate. He grabbed his flight jacket and said, "When do we leave?" The other pilots stared at him like he'd signed his own death warrant. Because he had. The plan was suicidal. A C-47 transport plane would tow Sullivan's glider through German airspace at night, flying dangerously low to avoid radar. When they reached the forest clearing, Sullivan would detach the tow rope and glide silently down through the darkness. If he missed the clearing by even 50 feet, he'd crash into the trees and die. If German troops heard him coming, they'd shoot him out of the sky. And even if he landed successfully, there was no guarantee he could take off again. Sullivan took off at midnight. The tow plane climbed to 8,000 feet, then descended rapidly as they crossed into German territory. Anti-aircraft fire erupted around them, tracer rounds streaking past the cockpit, explosions lighting up the night. Sullivan gripped the controls so hard his knuckles turned white. The tow pilot screamed over the radio, "We're taking hits! I can't hold this course." But Sullivan shouted back, "Keep going! I'm not turning back." At precisely 0200 hours, Sullivan reached the coordinates. He pulled the release lever and the tow rope snapped free. Suddenly, he was floating in complete silence. No engine, no radio, just the whisper of wind over the glider's wings. Below him, through the darkness, he could barely make out the small clearing where the wounded men waited. He had one chance to land, one chance to get this right. If he overshot, he'd crash. If he landed short, he'd hit the trees. His hands trembled on the stick. Sullivan dropped the glider into a steep dive, picking up speed. The trees rushed up toward him at terrifying velocity. At the last possible second, he pulled back on the stick, leveling out just above the treetops. Branches scraped the bottom of the glider, tearing fabric from the fuselage. Then, with a bone-jarring crash, the glider slammed into the clearing, bouncing twice before skidding to a stop. Sullivan was thrown against the instrument panel, blood pouring from his nose. But he was alive. Incredibly, impossibly alive. Sullivan kicked open the glider's door and stumbled out into the cold night. Immediately, he heard voices, German voices. Flashlights swept through the trees all around him. He'd landed directly in the middle of the enemy position. Panic seized him. Then, from the darkness, a weak American voice called out, "Over here! We're over here!" Sullivan ran toward the sound, his boots pounding on frozen ground, German soldiers shouting behind him. He found the 3 wounded airmen lying in a ditch, barely conscious. With superhuman strength, Sullivan dragged all 3 men toward the glider. Bullets began to hit the ground around them. The Germans had spotted them. Lowry was unconscious. Pennington was coughing up blood. Daniels kept repeating, "Leave me, leave me." But Sullivan refused. He shoved them into the glider's cargo bay one by one, their screams of pain echoing through the forest. German soldiers emerged from the trees, rifles firing. Sullivan dove into the pilot's seat and slammed the door shut. Bullets punched through the fabric walls around him. Now came the impossible part. Gliders can't take off by themselves. They have no engines. Sullivan's only hope was a technique called ground tow recovery, where a low-flying plane drops a hook that catches a loop of rope attached to the glider, yanking it into the air. But the technique had only been successfully performed twice before, both times in daylight, in controlled conditions. Sullivan radioed the C-47, "I need pickup now. We're taking heavy fire." The response crackled back, "We're coming in. God help us all." The C-47 came in low and fast, its engines roaring over the clearing. The German troops scattered, diving for cover. Sullivan extended the glider's tow rope loop on a pair of vertical poles, creating a target barely 6 feet wide. The C-47's hook, a steel V-shaped claw hanging from its belly, had to catch that loop on the first pass. There would be no second chance. Sullivan watched through the windscreen as the massive transport plane screamed toward him, flying impossibly low. The hook caught the loop. The impact was catastrophic. The glider was yanked forward so violently that Sullivan was slammed back in his seat, the G-forces crushing his chest. The wounded men in the cargo bay screamed as they were thrown against the walls. The glider's landing gear ripped clean off. For a horrifying moment, the whole aircraft tilted sideways, threatening to cartwheel and disintegrate. But then, impossibly, it leveled out. Sullivan was airborne. They were flying. The C-47 climbed rapidly, pulling the battered glider through the night sky. Sullivan's heart hammered in his chest. Blood dripped from his forehead onto the instruments. Behind him, the 3 wounded airmen lay in a tangled heap, barely alive, but breathing. German anti-aircraft fire chased them all the way to the border, but somehow, miraculously, every shell missed. When they finally crossed into Allied territory, Sullivan allowed himself one moment to close his eyes and breathe. They'd done it. Against every law of physics, they'd done it. They landed at the Allied base 30 minutes later. Medics rushed the 3 airmen to surgery. All 3 survived. Lowry lost his leg, but lived to see his grandchildren. Pennington recovered completely and returned to combat. Daniels carried shrapnel for the rest of his life. As for Captain Sullivan, he received the Distinguished Service Cross, though he never talked about that night. When reporters asked him how he pulled it off, he simply shrugged and said, "I just didn't think about dying." But here's the part that makes this story truly insane. After the war, military analysts reviewed the mission and concluded it should never have succeeded. The glider had landed with less than 5 feet of clearance on either side. Any less precision, and it would have crashed. The ground tow recovery had worked despite a hook mechanism that was damaged. 3 men who should have bled out survived. And Sullivan had flown through a German defensive position so fortified that bombers had been trying to destroy it for months. The German commander, Captain Weber, who had captured the Americans, was later asked why he didn't execute them. He said, "I looked at those 3 dying men and realized they weren't my enemy. War was my enemy. Weber survived and met Lowry in 1963. They shook hands and cried together. Two old soldiers who'd been enemies for one night, united by the impossibility of what had happened between them. I called for help, not because I was soft, Weber said, but because I was tired of death. Today, the glider sits in the Smithsonian. You can still see the bullet holes in its fabric skin, the twisted metal where the landing gear ripped off, the bloodstains that never quite washed away. A small plaque reads, CG-4A Waco Glider, The Impossible Rescue, April 1945. But what the plaque doesn't tell you is this. Sometimes, in the darkest moments of human history, courage doesn't just defy the odds, it rewrites them completely. That's what happened on that freezing night in Germany, when one insane pilot refused to leave 3 men behind. And what about Captain Sullivan? He flew gliders for 2 more years, then quietly retired to a small farm in Montana. He never gave interviews, never wrote a book. He died in 1989, and at his funeral, 3 old men appeared, Lowry, Pennington, and Daniels. They stood over his casket and saluted. Because they knew the truth that the rest of the world had forgotten. On one impossible night, when every rational person had given up hope, Ernest Sullivan proved that sometimes the most insane decisions are the only sane ones left to make. The mission was classified for 40 years. When records were declassified in 1985, historians were shocked. They found Sullivan's mission reports filled with technical details. But on the last page, Sullivan had written just 5 words. We couldn't leave them behind. That sentence, more than any medal or monument, explains why this rescue matters. Not because it was militarily significant, but because it proved that humanity survives even in war's darkest hours. Years later, researchers discovered something remarkable. German soldiers in that forest had been ordered to shoot down any aircraft, but when the glider came down, several deliberately aimed high. In post-war interviews, one admitted, "We knew it was a rescue. It seemed wrong to stop it." Even enemies exhausted by years of killing couldn't bring themselves to destroy an act of pure courage. War had tried to break them all. That night, it failed. This rescue changed military doctrine forever. The philosophy shifted to leave no one behind. Today, every special operations team trains on Sullivan's techniques. The impossible rescue became the foundation for saving thousands of lives in every conflict since. One man's insane decision echoed through history, proving that the greatest military innovations don't come from strategy meetings. They come from people who simply refuse to accept that someone has to die. So remember Captain Ernest Sullivan. Remember 3 dying men. Remember a German commander who chose mercy. Remember that on April 25, 1945, the impossible happened, not because someone had a better plan, but because someone simply refused to quit. That's the real story, not the tactics, not the technology. Just one human being who looked at 3 dying strangers and said, "Not on my watch."